Welcome back, everybody. This is the next episode in my tips and tricks series, and on this one I'm going to be going over the basics of filling and sanding the models. So a few different products I use, a different couple of putties I go over, some super glue techniques, as well as the easiest way I find applying, as well as sanding off the putty. So as I said in previous videos, this is the way I do things. Isn't necessarily going to work for you, and you guys may have better ideas and better techniques. So as always, leave them down below, your ideas. We'll go back to them. I'll go back to them in the future when I get time and try them out, see how they work. Might adopt some, but either way, we'll go over them in the future. So this is the basics of puttying and sanding plastic models. So as always, my name is Sean, and this is Sean's Aviation. So, for the basics of puttying with model putty, there's a couple of different products you can use. I've been using this Tamiya putty, the Tamiya white, for a while. It tends to dry relatively fast. It has good coverage, it's easy to work with. Because it dries a little faster, you can work with it a little bit quicker than others. Tamiya makes a bunch of different types of putty, some shorter, some longer. They also make one that is exposed to UV, so it stays pliable until it's hit with UV light, and then it hardens solid. So there's a lot of different products Tamiya makes. One of the other go-tos is this Squadron green putty from Squadron.com. They make quite a bit of their own internal products, and this is their green putty. I've used this before in the past. Unfortunately, the whole tube dried out before I was able to use it, and I moved on to the Tamiya white because it was easy to get locally. But I've started going back to using, well, I will use this stuff once my Tamiya was out. They're both pretty comparable in terms of quality, but just depends on what you prefer, what you can get locally. There's also the ability to use super glue. I'll have a little bit of a how-to on that in a little later in this video. You can see the basics of using a gap-filling super glue. And for some, surprisingly, I just use plain old white glue, what you buy at a Walmart or whatnot. I guess in the U.S. you have like Target. We don't have those up here anymore. But yeah, so just your generic basic white glue. It works well for some complicated compound curves that would be very hard to get into. I'll throw up a picture. I think I have a shot of my in progress on that one. I built a MiG-29, and with the vertical stabilizers glued into the fuselage, there was a bit of a gap, and getting a 90-degree corner with puttying and sanding and all the complicated shapes around the vertical stabs, I just used white glue, put it in nice and thick, let it sit for a few minutes, and then just with a wet cloth wipe, and it takes all the excess away, and you're left with the white glue in the center there, and it makes a nice joint. It's good for little tiny tight corners like that. I wouldn't use it for large seams, but in little tiny tight corners it's easy to get into, fill it, don't have to worry about it after that. So a quick wipe with a wet cloth and you're done. So, white putty. I use toothpicks. You want to basically find anything that has a nice flat surface that allows you to do what you need to do. If you get buildup on it, you can just grab a cloth. I just use a Kleenex I have under here, and you can just wipe that off, get as much of the residual gunk, shmoo, as I've heard it called, the residual shmoo, off the tip. Make sure it's not going to leave little bits inside your model. Squeeze a little bit out. If you leave the cap off for too long, it starts to dry out. So if you're going to work relatively quickly, you can just leave the cap off. Just a little tiny bit. Actually, I'll just do it this way. Just a little tiny bit on the end of your toothpick is all you need. And then you work your way along the seam. And some people will use masking tape to delineate a little area so that you don't get lots of over application. I find I can just usually wipe the excess off with the toothpick. This is a nice sort of flat surface, so it doesn't make much of a difference. But you'll see it's already starting to dry up and solidify, so it can only has a small quick working period. But that's that, and then when that sands down, it'll sand down nice and flat. So just the barest of amounts And same thing back here. This seam here isn't as bad. There's just a little tiny bit at the front here. Maybe a little bit back here. But you can see you can apply a little bit, and then you can take the excess off and just use the tip in order to smear, and you're able to apply just a little bit kind of where it needs to be. So this little area back here has a pretty good little seam. You might be able to see on that angle, the little dark spot there is a sunken seam. So you can just apply some of this. It's starting to dry out, so I'm going to have to switch out for some new stuff soon. But the toothpick is nice because it's flat enough to make a nice application surface, but you have a nice small point that you can get in and clean out around the little bits. And then the tough one on this is going to be here at the leading edges. The wing roots, there's a tiny piece of fuselage that joins up with the wing. So you just want to get in there nice and tight. And try to avoid getting the putty on the inside because it's already painted. Yeah, this is starting to dry out on me here. So yeah, we'll just leave it at that. That's a nice good first application. We'll give that a bit of sanding, and then we'll do another once over and check for any other places that need a little bit of putty. So that is sort of the basics of applying putty. Again, I use toothpicks. They're nice, they're cheap, they're reusable. Some people, you'll see it, will use metal putty knives. As I said, you'll see people delineate with masking tape to get just a tiny little bit of putty right in the middle. It saves from sanding the entire surface. I find I can blend it better when I have a nice wide surface, as long as you scrape out a lot of the excess. I'd rather put a few tiny coats on than one big thick coat and try to sand it out. But to each their own. You'll eventually learn your own. As is everything with this, you'll kind of learn your own technique as you go, something that works for you, and then you continue with that. So stay tuned here. You'll see some more application techniques and types, and I will show you a little bit of the sanding techniques in a little bit, so stay tuned. Okay, here we are back, a couple of hours since the application of the putty, so it's had a bit of time to dry. So now we're going to look at some sanding. I have two different types of sandpaper I normally use. For the life of me, I can't remember now what grit they are. The brown one here is a coarser grit. The black one is the finer grit. Give me 1 second. 1 second. I will pull out the paper and I'll tell you in a second what it is. Okay, so here's what it is. The darker one here is a 220 grit paper, and then the black one, this guy here, is a 600 grit. Both of these things I just picked up at the local hardware store. I do believe both of these I actually got the ubiquitous Canadian Tire. So 600 grit to start. 220 grit to start, 600 grit to follow up. This is a wet paper, so you can actually wet it with water to get a polishing effect. I've never really done that. I find with most primers, most of the scratches that the 600 grit leave completely disappears. But always start with a coarser grit. As you remember, I added the putty on a bit of a wide, sort of rough application. Didn't really worry too much. But now I'll go along, just use my finger. It's nice and easy. A little bit of gentle pressure. You don't want to sand in the same place too long. If you always add pressure to one location, you'll have a flat spot form. Another trick you can always do is just go in little circles. I find that way you have sort of the the grit will attack in every direction versus just in one, which it also limits the amount of scratches you have to clean up at the end, as well as limiting the chance of a flat spot forming in a compound curve area. You do want to limit the breathing in of this dust if you are going to be doing a lot of sanding. Probably a good idea to wear a mask. Always try to be in a well-ventilated workplace. My room down here is quite large. I'm not terribly worried about breathing it in. But yeah, so you just give it a good... in the cases here, we have your single seam running the length of it, and you have a step from one side to the other. Sanding along the seam won't necessarily do much. You want to sand across the seam in order to level that step out. But then, like as I said, you also want to do a bit of a all-around circle sanding, just to ensure that you keep it consistent and you don't have any buildup in one particular area. So there you go. You can see after sanding, almost all of that putty disappeared. There's just a little bit here in some low spots, and then especially up in this area where there's a giant larger step. I missed a spot here. I'll clean that up a little later. Once I get the canopy in place, I use some white glue to fill any gaps around the edge of the forward canopy, and then I can use just a tiny bit of putty just to clean up that seam right there once it's all assembled. So stuff like that you don't want to clean up too much. If I sand that flat, clean it up and get it as as perfect as possible, I'll add the canopy, and then it could end up with a larger step. So try to clean up as much as you can at the final construction. So I'm not too worried about that at this point. Same along the tail here. I find the finger is really good because you form to whatever you're working on. I've seen people use bits of wood or whatever to form a dowel for the paper, and you're locked into the diameter of the dowel. Your finger has some give in it, it's cushioned, so you're not doing too much damage. Still quite a large step there. I'll have to do a second coat of putty in order to clean that up. The other thing you can always do is fold the paper over on itself like I just did here, and then you have a seam where there's sandpaper on all three sides. So that way you can, if you see here on the bottom, there's just a little bump where there's an antenna mounting point. So by folding the sandpaper over on itself and pushing, you can get into that edge, and it sands it nice. You don't have to worry too much about wearing down on the detail, because you actually have a little bit of sandpaper that gets right into that corner. It almost creates a little file-like effect. And again, you can see that the seam runs sort of, I'll say up and down in your view right now. So I'm going to sand across the seam and level that putty out so that this piece and this piece have a level. If I go this way, I can actually sand a dip into that putty, and I'm still going to create a step. So by going back perpendicular to the seam, it ensures that you're actually creating the look you want to look instead of making it worse. And then for the final bit, I will use one of my angled, triangular angled, triangle? Yeah, that's a triangle. Triangular cross-section files. And you can get that little corner right up tight against that little shape, and you can ensure that you dig out all the little bit of putty that has built up in that little seam. Just like that. And there you go. You can see that seam has been cleaned up nice. There's a nice smooth contour between the two sides. And obviously it's tough to see if I've missed anything on that, so you shoot it with a coat of primer. Once you get a bit of a finer grit, use the finer grit sandpaper to clean up all those little scratches, almost polish it to a nice smooth look, and give it a coat of primer, and then make sure that still looks good. If it needs more, it needs more, This is sort of the dreaded time frame for me when it comes to building models. I call it the putty, sand, repeat time frame, because I find some kits just that's all you do. You putty, you wait a couple hours, you know, usually about once a, you know, maybe a day you can come down, put a bit of putty on the model, let it sit for a few hours, come back later in the day, give it a quick sand, find all of the warts that are left over, another coat of putty, wait a day, sand it the next day. Find the problems, rinse, wash, repeat. Putty, sand, repeat. It's a tedious part of building because at the end of it all, you still have to go around and check all of your panel lines, all of your detail. You have to ensure that you haven't missed anything. You got to clean up, add any detail you missed. You know, if you sanded off some surface detail, rescribing some of the panel lines. You might have to cheat a little bit to recreate some details that you've sanded away. It is not an easy process, but for those of us and you who want to have a clean, accurate looking build, in this case here you can see I grabbed a round profile file, and I'm just getting into this point here. It's got a bit of a compound curve. You've got the wing leading edge curling in, so that's this way. You've also got the curve this way, and you've got a curve this way. So it's a 3-axis curve going on in here. So I use a round file, and that way you can try to preserve the curves that are traveling in every direction. You can actually use the putty as a way of recreating those curves, and you don't lose the compound curve. So there, all the putty I applied to this TA152 has been sanded and cleaned up. So while I'm at this part, I might as well just go right ahead. You can kind of see on the nose section the scratches. You can see it in the wing too. The scratches that are left from the sanding with the any file work and any of the 600 grit that I 220 grit that I used. So I'll go ahead with the 600 grit. You want to try to do it perpendicular to the other ones. If you've noticed that all of your sanding has been in one direction, all your scratches are in one direction, you want to go perpendicular to sand the scratches away. If you sand with the scratches, you're just enhancing, you're just highlighting the scratches that are there. If you cross the scratches, you level the scratches off, you polish the surface. So in this case, it's a little bit of everything, so I'm just going to kind of go in a circular motion the way I did before. You also want to ensure that when you do the next level of sanding, when you go to a finer grit sanding, you want to take it out past the previous sanding job. You want to be able to blend the surfaces together. So if for this case I sanded pretty much just this little narrow area, I'm going to take the finer grit over and farther away. Make sure that any little outlier scratches that exist get cleaned up. And then everything blends together and the whole surface all looks the same, all looks uniform. So there we go. You can now see that the scratches here have tended to fade. It's hard to tell until you get a coat of primer how good you did. If you add your primer, you can still see some surface scratches. The good thing with primer, especially I used Tamiya primer. I'll do another video on priming. But you add the primer, it adds just a thin layer of paint. If you see any scratches, you can sometimes sand the scratches down, and the primer will actually fill the scratch marks and level itself out. So it actually helps with the filling and cleaning up. So primer is good on that sense. But like I said, I'll do a bit of a video on the priming. So this is pretty much it. All I have to do is just repeat this process all the way around. So I'm going to leave you off here. I'm going to jump next to the segment. You didn't see it yet, but before I did the white primer, the white putty, I actually did a little bit of super glue work along this nose seam. So let's jump to that now. Jump forward in this video, backwards in my time. You can see a little bit of how the super gluing works to clean it up. So I think that's it. We've covered basics of sanding, a little bit of the puttying, cleaning up that, some super glue. Oh, you know what? We'll jump to the super glue bit, and then we'll come back here, and I will show you another filling technique for very large, stubborn seams. So, super glue. Here we go. So here we are. When it comes to some types of fill jobs, you need to use a little bit of super glue. As I said in previous videos, this is styrene acrylate, basically just your store brand super glue. This is a Bob Smith Industries makes a couple different variations of this. This one's sort of a gap filling medium density. So what you want to do, perfect example, this is this seam across the top. There's a bit of a step, there's a few gaps. Specifically, if you look on the bottom, there's no seam running the entire length of that gap. So that top seam is the only thing holding this entire nose section together. So you want it to be a little bit on the strong side. So the easiest thing to do is just take this, it comes down to a nice fine tip, so you get some good accuracy. Just run a tiny bead just down, you know, maybe a couple of drops here and there, just all the way down that seam. I use a toothpick. You can just smooth that out a little bit. That way it's going to fill all of those gaps. Any gap in the plastic will be filled by that super glue. And then when it dries, it will help ensure a nice tight bond. As well as once it's dry, you can sand it smooth and it will fill any of those gaps. So not only does it fill the gaps as a filler, but it bonds the gaps and ensures a tight seam. So for example, if this was a seam where it didn't have any structural need, plain old the putty, the sanding, the types I've used before, that'll be your go-to. In this case, where you also want to fill some gaps and keep those gaps strong, ensure that it becomes a structural support for the airframe, that super glue is a great way of doing it. So there you go. Other than that, it sands just like regular putty. So that is another option for when you are attempting to do some puttying and some gap filling. So gap filling super glue takes a bit of practice, but like anything in model, it's not that difficult, and you got a nice strong seam. So there you go, and we'll move on to the sanding portion of this once it's dry. So welcome back. We have in front of me now the Dora 9. You'll see I already got some putty and whatnot added to it. One thing you will notice, I think I mentioned earlier in this with this aircraft, I'll actually throw the clip up now just so you can see it. I had some pretty large gaps in the wing. So jump back, here's the video of what those gaps look like. So as you can see, quite large gap. It's going to be very hard to fill that size of a gap with putty. The putty will crack and fall out. As well, it's tough to keep the contour going. So what I have done is I've actually filled that seam with some sheet styrene. So you'll actually see I've got sheet styrene here. You can pick this up at any hobby store. It's the exact same type of plastic that the model's made out of, but it comes in sheets. Usually 8x10. They're made by Evergreen Plastics. So they come in these, this has all been cut up for my use. They come in 8x10 sheets. Sometimes you can buy strips, you can buy them wider, you can buy 8x10 sheets, just depends on what you need them for. But as you can see here, they come in different thicknesses. They're pretty standard thicknesses that they come in. For example here, let me just get my caliper zeroed out. So this thicker guy here, this guy here is, I have it in millimeters, which isn't going to help for most of you. Here we go, inch fractions, that's what I want. So this guy here, 5/128, which means absolutely nothing. 3, I go slightly larger, 3/64. So that's a 3/64, which if you go down to 2/64, it's 1/32. Let's say that's 1/32 of an inch, probably what it is. The thinner stuff here, that's 1/64. So you got 1/64 and 1/32. So roughly this guy here is twice the thickness of this guy here. So you know, you can get it in varying thicknesses, you can get it in varying sizes. It's handy if you're doing any scratch building projects because you can actually get it in cubed, in triangles, in round stock, in whatever you happen to need for your current project. I think I might have, oh, let's see if I can find, yeah, here we go. So strips, 0.01 of an inch by 0.02 of an inch, you know, 0.3 by 0.04, 0.15 by 0.08, etc., etc., 0.15 by 0.04. So there's all these different sizes for if you're doing any type of scratch building of details or whatnot. As I said, you can get tubes. Here's a 1/4 inch tube. So if I'm doing an aircraft, I can put the tube inside and use it as a stand. You can use it for really whatever you'd like to use it for. That's the joy of scratch building. So when it comes to filling cracks with styrene, what you kind of want to do is you want to find a piece that is roughly the size of the opening you have. So if you see on this, one side's a little thicker than the other, so I use the 1/32 on one side and a 1/64 on the other. It may not be perfect. I mean, in reality, if I really wanted to measure the dehydral, I might be out by a fraction of an inch when it's all said and done, but it's going to look better than if I have a massive gap in the wing with horribly sanded out detail. So I'll throw up a couple of, I didn't get a real video tutorial of me doing this, but I took a couple of still shots as I went through the progress. So I'll throw those up sort of as I explained what I did. So what I would do is I'd find a piece of stock that would be roughly the width of the opening. I would hold it in place, and using a marker, I have a super fine Sharpie. So a super fine tip Sharpie, almost a pinhole of a fine tipped marker. So something nice and fine. A sharp pencil would work as well. The problem with pencil is it tends to rub off easily on the plastic, but whatever works for you works for you. I happen to use a Sharpie. So I'd put the piece into the opening, hold it in place. I would take my pen and I would trace the upper profile of the gap. And you would end up with something that would look, for argument's sake, like this. So for argument's sake, you would end up with an outline looking something like this, right? So that line is the upper profile of the wing, and everything below the line is the piece of plastic that would actually sit down inside the wing surface. Cut it out with an X-Acto knife. It does not have to be perfect. So cut it out with an X-Acto knife, and that would actually hold it in place. You always want just a little bit sticking out proud of the surface. Stick it in, add the glue, let it dry. You'll notice I'll throw it with the, as you can see with the static pictures, I would have the wingtip taped up across the fuselage. Keep tension on that wing root, make sure it dries nice and solid on both sides. Hold it for a few seconds, make sure there's lots of glue surface, and then add the tape to hold it there long term. Let that sit, you know, a good solid couple of hours, make sure it's nice and dry. Repeat the same process on the other side with the appropriate size styrene. As you can see here, there are some times where, you know, it's a tiny little area and you just jam a big piece in there, glue it, and then cut it free with an X-Acto knife later on. So you're going to be left with a pretty gnarly looking hole down the middle. And what I use in those cases, where did you go? This guy here, it's a little tiny X-Acto blade, or handle, tiny little handle, with basically a chisel blade on it. Focus. It's not liking this at all. Anyways, you get the idea. It's a chisel blade. Let's get this guy out of the way. So you can see it's just a flat, angled chisel blade. So when you get your little piece of styrene glued in between and sandwiched in place, you can just take this chisel blade and along the surface, I'll show you with the plane, so you can imagine here, you know, you've got your styrene sticking up proud of the surface. You just take your chiseled knife, get the angle in there, and you just go along slowly, bit by bit, chisel that down as smooth as you can get it with the surrounding surface. The angled blade is nice because if you go on straight, you get a nice wide blade. If you come on more of an angle, you get just a tiny blade. So you can, your surface area that's touching is only good, you can adjust how wide it is. So if you only have a narrow space to get in, you can just get in there narrowly and just scrape away a little bit at a time, clean up that edge, and you're left with a surface that is almost the same level as the surrounding styrene. Once you get that down as close as you can with the chisel, make sure you go nice and tight, nice and small bits at a time. Don't rip out the detail kit plastic around it. Try to focus just on the styrene you inserted. You're going to leave just a little bit of that left because you can't get in there. And that's where you just grab your sandpaper, you grab your round files if you have one. That's why this is good to have. This is a more advanced technique. You need the more advanced tools. You get in there, boom, boom, boom. Bob's your uncle. She's all cleaned up. You're good to go. Once it's sanded, you can't even tell. If you look, I'll take the point of this. I can drag it from edge to edge through that radius, and it doesn't catch at all. Maybe a little bit right there. You know, in all honesty, there's a little hair, but pick up there. You can just keep smoothing that out. But you know, I can scrape across that. I can scrape across that almost all the way, and I mean, there's no catch, right? That is an extremely tight fit. The angles are almost exactly. The fit that you're looking at with that insert is no worse. In some cases, I would say even better than that seam would be if you just assembled the kit on a normal kit. So yeah, the only thing I still have to worry about is here on the front. You can see where the cannon is. Due to the misalignment of these two wings, there's a little hole right there, a little extra hole where the cannon should have lined up and it doesn't. I'll just fill that up with a little bit of white glue at a later date. Not even going to notice it's there. So that is how you can fill stubborn lines. So I've started with the simple, the white putty, application, sanding, cleanup, how to fill gaps. If you have a more stubborn, slightly thicker seam that you need a little bit more strength on, you've seen the super glue method. Apply the super glue. It will not only fill, but it creates bonding. So that's great for some of those stubborn seams where you still need to have a little bit of structural strength. And finally, you've seen the styrene method of, would help if that was framed. You've seen the styrene method of filling larger gaps. This styrene method, it works great here in wing roots. You can also use it in any type of this area here. If you find the fuselage is too narrow for what you need, you know, you put the upper piece on and the upper piece is wider than this, you can pop the seam, insert the piece of styrene, pop that seam out, and then you can go ahead and clean it up afterwards, add your putty. You know, if you do like a large piece here, then a smaller piece here, the gap in the middle can be filled with either super glue or a combination of super glue and putty. Use all three together if you need to get what you need to get done. But that is the basics of how you putty, fill, sand, clean up seams. So yes, thank you for watching this video and this tutorial. If you have any questions or any tips of your own, tips that you would like to add in the comments section, ideas of your own, I definitely will keep track of comments on this stuff. And I can, you know what, I can always go back in the future and try your techniques on another model. So, thank you for watching, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you for watching, guys, and as always, if you are interested in any of the content you see, you can access my website at www.seans-aviation.com. You can see all the latest pictures of aircraft and museums and the build logs of all of my current models and past models on that site. And if you're interested in any of this content, please click the subscribe button here on YouTube to follow more. Thank you very much, and see you guys next time.